The wind screamed across the Wyoming plains like the wrath of God himself, driving snow so thick a man could lose his way between his front door and his barn. It was the kind of storm that turned familiar landscapes into alien territory, the kind that claimed lives without mercy or warning. The temperature had been dropping for 3 days, and now the blizzard unleashed its full fury on everything foolish enough to be caught in the open. Caleb Thornton pulled his hat low against the stinging ice crystals and urged his horse forward through the white hell. Behind him, barely visible through the swirling chaos, his 11-year-old son Daniel rode close on his sturdy paint pony, bundled so thick in wool and leather he looked like a small bear clinging to the saddle. The cattle had scattered when the storm hit, driven by instinct and terror across the rolling hills of their small ranch. Every head loss meant another month of beans and hardtack instead of proper meals. Another month of wondering if they could hold on to the land that had become their entire world. "Pa, I can't see the fence line anymore," Daniel called out, his young voice nearly swallowed by the howling wind that seemed to come from every direction at once. Caleb twisted in his saddle, his beard already crusted with ice, squinting through the driving snow toward where he knew the boundary of their property should be. The boy was right. The familiar landmarks that had guided them across this land for 5 years had vanished completely into the white void. Even the barn, which should have been visible as a dark smudge no more than 50 yards behind them, had disappeared as if the earth had swallowed it whole. "Stay close, son. We follow the creek bed back home. Your grandfather will have the coffee hot and be telling us what fools we are for going out in weather like this." Daniel managed a grin despite the cold that had turned his cheeks red and as autumn apples and made his eyes water. At 11, the boy had already learned the harsh arithmetic of frontier life. Cattle meant survival. Cattle meant the difference between keeping the ranch his father had built with his own hands and joining the growing ranks of failed homesteaders who drifted from town to town looking for work that barely paid enough to keep body and soul together. His mother Sarah had taught him that before the consumption took her 5 winters ago, leaving behind a grief that still shadowed his father's eyes and a determination that had hardened into something approaching obsession. Now it was just the three of them against whatever the territory threw at them. Caleb, Daniel, and Jeremiah, the old man whose hands had shaped this land back when it was still territory disputed between the Sioux, and the railroad barons. They had been riding for nearly an hour, following the meandering path of Willow Creek as it cut through the rolling landscape. The creek was their lifeline, the source of water that made their small spread viable, and in weather like this, it served as their compass home. But the snow was falling so thick now that even the dark line of cottonwoods that marked the creek's course appeared only as ghostly suggestions in the white. Caleb's horse, a reliable mare named Duchess who had carried him through 3 hard winters, suddenly shied violently to the left, her ears flattened back and nostrils flaring wide. She snorted and danced sideways, her shoes finding uncertain purchase on the snow-covered ground, clearly agitated by something ahead that the storm had hidden from human eyes. "Whoa, girl," Caleb murmured, his voice carrying the calm authority learned during 3 years as a field medic in the Indian Wars. He dismounted carefully, his boots sinking deep into powder that came nearly to his knees. Each step was an effort, the snow clinging to his legs and seeping into his boots despite the heavy leather and careful waterproofing. What he had first taken for a fallen tree resolved itself into something that made his blood run cold. It was a woman, and she was dying. She lay crumpled against the base of a snow-laden pine, her dark hair spread across the white ground like spilled ink. Her traveling coat, once fine wool dyed deep blue, was now sodden and torn, offering little protection against the killing cold. One arm lay twisted beneath her body at an angle that suggested injury, while the other was flung out as if she had tried to break her fall. Caleb dropped to his knees beside her, his hands already moving with the sure competence that had saved lives on a dozen battlefields. Her lips were blue, nearly purple in the dim light that filtered through the storm clouds, and her skin had taken on the waxy pallor that spoke of advanced hypothermia. But when he pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck, feeling for the pulse point beneath the cold skin, he detected the faint, irregular flutter that meant life still flickered within her. "Daniel, bring the rope and my heavy coat," he called, without taking his eyes from the woman. The boy obeyed without question, leading his pony closer through the deep snow while maintaining the kind of steady competence that would have made his grandfather proud. At 11, Daniel had already learned that emergencies required action, not questions. 15 feet away, barely visible through the swirling snow, lay the carcass of what had once been a magnificent bay horse. Even in death, the animal's breeding was obvious. This had been a horse worth more than most men earned in a year, with clean lines and the kind of careful conformation that spoke of generations of selective breeding. The saddle and bridle, partially buried in snow, showed the same quality, hand-tooled leather with silver fittings that caught what little light penetrated the storm. Scattered around the scene like the debris of some terrible accident were the remnants of someone's desperate flight. A leather satchel had burst open, spilling papers that whipped and danced in the wind before disappearing into the white. A lady's hat, Aaron, adorned with feathers that had once been fashionable, lay trampled into the snow. And everywhere, staining the pristine white in spreading patches of dark red, was blood. Too much blood. And Caleb's experienced eye told him that not all of it had come from the horse. "Pa, is she dead?" Daniel asked quietly, his young face serious beyond his years, as he took in the scene with the kind of practical assessment that frontier life demanded of its children. "Not yet," Caleb replied grimly, "but she will be if we don't get her warm fast." He began his examination methodically, checking for obvious injuries while fighting against time and the elements that seemed determined to claim another victim. The woman's breathing was shallow and irregular, each exhalation visible as a small puff of vapor that disappeared almost instantly in the wind. Her pulse was weak but present, and when he lifted her eyelids to check her pupils, he saw eyes the color of storm clouds that seemed to flicker with some deep intelligence, even in unconsciousness. She wore traveling clothes of obvious quality, the kind that wealthy Eastern women might choose for a journey west. Her boots were custom-made, soft leather that had been crafted by someone who understood both fashion and function. But it was when he pushed back her coat sleeve to check for injuries that Caleb found something that made him pause. A tattoo, small and intricate, had been etched into the pale skin of her inner wrist. It was no crude sailor's mark or frontier decoration, but something that spoke of careful artistry and significant meaning. The design looked like a family crest, all flowing lines and heraldic symbols that suggested old money and older traditions, the kind of marking that wealthy families used to identify their own, to mark bloodlines and inherited privilege. On her right hand, beneath a glove of finest kid skin, was a ring that reinforced his growing suspicions about this woman's background. Not the simple gold band of a rancher's wife or the practical jewelry of a frontier woman, but an elaborate arrangement of gold and precious stones that probably cost more than his ranch was worth. The central stone was a ruby the size of a man's thumbnail, surrounded by smaller diamonds that caught and reflected even the dim light of the storm. "Who are you?" he murmured to the unconscious woman, and for a fleeting moment Sarah's face flashed in his memory. Another woman who had needed his help, who had trusted him to keep her safe. He had failed Sarah. He would not fail this stranger. The question burned in his mind as he worked to save her life, driven by a need for redemption he barely understood. This was not some unfortunate traveler caught by bad weather. The expensive horse, the quality of her clothes, the obvious wealth displayed in her jewelry, all spoke of someone far removed from the ordinary run of people who traveled through Wyoming territory. And the blood in the snow, the scattered papers, the general appearance of flight and desperation suggested that her presence here was no accident. Working quickly but carefully, Caleb lifted the woman in his arms, surprised by how light she felt despite her obvious height, and the fine bones of her face that spoke of good breeding and the kind of nutrition that only money could buy. Her head lolled against his chest as he carried her toward his horse, her dark hair falling in tangles that had once been an elaborate arrangement suitable for polite society. Getting an unconscious woman onto a horse in the middle of a blizzard while managing a worried 11-year-old and two increasingly nervous animals required every bit of skill and experience that Caleb had accumulated in his 36 years of life. The horses sensed the storm's growing intensity and wanted nothing more than to find shelter, while the wind seemed determined to tear everything from his grasp. But somehow, drawing on reserves of strength and determination that had carried him through war and loss and the grinding hardship of frontier life, he managed it. He settled the woman in front of him on the saddle, one arm holding her securely against his chest while he guided Duchess with the other. Daniel rode close beside them, his young face set with concentration as he fought to control his pony in the increasingly difficult conditions. The ride back to the ranch was a nightmare journey through a world gone white and wild. The woman remained unconscious throughout, her breathing so shallow that more than once Caleb found himself checking to make sure she was still alive. The wind drove snow into their faces like thrown needles, each crystal sharp enough to draw blood. Cold bit through wool and leather with teeth that found every gap, every seam, turning breath to ice in their lungs and stealing feeling from fingers despite thick gloves. More than once during that terrible ride, Caleb wondered if he was making a mistake. Perhaps he should have left her where he found her and raced for help in Bear Creek, 20 miles away through country that was treacherous even in good weather. But help was hours away even under the best conditions, and she would have been frozen solid long before he could return with a doctor or even basic medical supplies. So he pressed on through the storm, guided by instinct in the faint dark line of trees that marked the creek. Trusting to Duchess's sure footing and his own knowledge of country he had covered thousands of times in the 5 years since they had lost everything and started over with nothing but determination and the clothes on their backs. The barn materialized out of the storm like a divine blessing, its familiar bulk offering the promise of shelter from the killing wind. The structure was solid, built from logs that Caleb had cut and shaped himself, chinked with mud and stones gathered from the creek bed. It wasn't much compared to the grand barns of the big ranches, but it was theirs, free and clear, and it had never looked more welcoming than it did in that moment. Daniel slid from his pony with the quick grace of youth and ran ahead to wrestle open the big double doors, his small figure disappearing momentarily in the swirl of snow before the warm yellow glow of lamplight spilled out across the white ground. Caleb guided Duchess inside, feeling the incredible relief of solid walls and a roof overhead, the sudden quiet after hours of howling wind that felt almost supernatural in its completeness. "Good Lord Almighty, what have you found now?" Jeremiah Thornton emerged from the house, lamplight spilling golden across the snow behind his tall spare frame. At 71, the old man moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to husband his strength, but his eyes were still sharp as a hawk's and missed nothing of what went on around his domain. Those keen eyes took in the scene instantly. The unconscious woman draped across Caleb's saddle, the blood that stained his son's coat, the grim set of determination on a face that bore too much resemblance to his own for comfort. In 30 years of working cattle ranches from Texas to Montana, Jeremiah had seen plenty of death and suffering, enough to last several lifetimes. But he had also raised a son who would risk his own life to save a stranger, and that was both a source of immense pride and constant worry. "Found her near the creek," Caleb said as he carefully lifted the woman down from the saddle. "Horse was dead. She was near frozen. Couldn't leave her out there." Jeremiah nodded once, the gesture containing both approval and resignation. He had known this moment would come eventually. Caleb had always been the type to bring home strays, whether they were orphaned calves or wounded birds, or apparently mysterious women caught in blizzards. It was a trait that had gotten him into trouble more than once, but it was also what made him the kind of man worth following into hell, if necessary. "Bring her inside then. I'll stoke the fire and put water on to heat. Daniel, see to the horses and then get yourself warm. You look half frozen." The Thornton cabin was small but well built, constructed by Caleb's own hands from logs cut in the hills above the ranch. It represented everything he had been able to salvage from the disaster that had claimed their original spread, every nail and board a testament to his refusal to be broken by forces beyond his control. One main room served as kitchen, dining area, and parlor, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall. Two small bedrooms branched off to either side, barely large enough for beds and simple furniture, but adequate for their needs. It wasn't much when compared to the grand house they had once called home, with its 12 rooms and wraparound porches and view of the best grazing land in the territory. But it was warm and dry, and most importantly, it was theirs. No banker held paper on it. No railroad lawyer could take it away with a stroke of the pen. It represented something that money couldn't buy: true independence. They carried the woman into Caleb's bedroom, the one closest to the big fireplace where the heat would reach her most effectively. In the warm lamplight, He could see her more clearly for the first time since he had found her in the snow. She was perhaps 33, with the kind of refined features that spoke of generations of careful breeding and the advantages that came with inherited wealth. Her skin, despite the pallor of near death, had the smooth quality that came from a lifetime of protection from sun and wind and the harsh realities that marked most frontier women before their time. Her dark hair, now lying in tangles around a face that would have been beautiful under better circumstances, showed signs of having been elaborately arranged earlier in the day. This was not a woman accustomed to rough travel or primitive conditions. Everything about her, from the fine bones of her hands to the way she held herself even in unconsciousness, spoke of Eastern finishing schools and drawing rooms where the greatest hardship was choosing between tea services. "Help me get these wet clothes off her," Caleb instructed Daniel, who had seen enough of life and death on a frontier ranch to take such necessities in stride without embarrassment or false modesty. They worked quickly but carefully, replacing her soaked garments with dry flannel nightclothes that had once belonged to Sarah and thick wool blankets that still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets his wife had favored. As they worked, Jeremiah bustled around the cabin with the efficient movements of a man who had dealt with emergencies before. He placed stones from the hearth in flannel wrappings and arranged them around the woman's body, heated beef broth that would provide nourishment when she was able to take it, and prepared the kind of warming remedies that had saved more than one victim of Wyoming's brutal winters. But it was as they were settling the heated stones around her that Jeremiah noticed what Caleb had seen by the creek. The ring on her finger caught the firelight, throwing sparkles of red and gold across the cabin walls. It was the kind of jewelry that belonged in drawing rooms and opera houses, not in frontier cabins or on dangerous winter journeys. And when her sleeve fell back as they adjusted the blankets, both men saw clearly the small, intricate tattoo that marked her inner wrist. Jeremiah's eyes narrowed as he studied it, his expression shifting from concern to something approaching suspicion. "That's not a rancher's wife," he said quietly, his voice carrying undertones that spoke of long experience with trouble and the various forms it could take. "No," Caleb agreed, pulling the blankets higher around the woman's shoulders and checking her breathing once more. "Question is, who is she, and what was she doing out in weather like this with no escort and a dead horse?" The answer came 2 hours later, as the three men sat around the kitchen table sharing coffee and wondering what morning would bring. The woman's eyes fluttered open for the first time since Caleb had found her, revealing irises the color of storm clouds that seemed to hold depths of intelligence and perhaps something that might have been fear. Those eyes moved around the unfamiliar cabin with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating situations rapidly and thoroughly. She took in the rough log walls, the simple furniture, the three men watching her with expressions of concern and curiosity, and something in her face shifted subtly, as if she were making calculations and decisions too complex for them to follow. "Where?" she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying the refined accent of Eastern education and social privilege. "You're safe," Caleb said quickly, moving to sit beside the bed while maintaining a respectful distance. "This is my cabin near Willow Creek. I found you in the storm. Your horse didn't make it, but you're alive." The woman tried to sit up, her face contorting with pain as movement reminded her of injuries and exposure. She fell back against the pillow, one hand going to her head as if checking for damage, while the other instinctively pulled the blankets higher around her. "The others," she managed, her voice gaining slightly in strength but still barely above a whisper. "Were there others with me?" Caleb and Jeremiah exchanged glances heavy with significance. Daniel leaned forward from his position by the fire, his young face serious as he tried to understand the implications of her question. "No others," Caleb said carefully. "Just you and the horse. Who were you traveling with? We might be able to send word, let people know you're safe." But the woman had already drifted back into unconsciousness, leaving them with more questions than answers, and a growing sense that her presence in their cabin represented complications they were not prepared to handle. For 3 days, she slipped in and out of awareness while the storm continued to rage outside with unabated fury. During her lucid moments, which came more frequently as her strength gradually returned, she spoke little but observed everything with the kind of careful attention that suggested a mind accustomed to gathering and evaluating information. She gave her name as Mary Walsh, claimed to be a widow traveling to visit relatives in Colorado, and offered no explanation for why she had been caught alone in the storm or where her escort and luggage had gone. Her story was plausible enough on the surface, but there were details that didn't quite fit, inconsistencies that nagged at Jeremiah's suspicious mind and made him watch her with the wariness of a man who had survived 7 decades by trusting his instincts. Daniel, however, took to her immediately, fascinated by her soft Eastern accent and the cultured way she spoke to him as if he were an adult rather than a child whose opinions could be safely ignored. During her stronger moments, she would tell him stories of great cities with buildings that reached toward the clouds, of ships that carried goods from countries so far away their names sounded like magic spells to a boy who had never been farther from home than Bear Creek. She spoke of museums filled with wonders from across the world, of libraries that contained more books than a person could read in several lifetimes, of theaters where actors brought stories to life on stages larger than their entire cabin. To Daniel, these tales opened vistas of possibility he had never imagined, while to Jeremiah they confirmed his growing suspicions that this woman came from a world far removed from Wyoming ranches and frontier hardships. But it was the small details that really bothered the old man, the inconsistencies that his lifetime of experience told him to note and remember. Her hands, while soft and well cared for, showed calluses in places that suggested regular practice with firearms, not the kind of genteel accomplishments expected of wealthy widows. Her clothes, while travel-worn and damaged by her ordeal, were of a quality that cost more than most working men earned in a year. And there was something about her bearing, the unconscious authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, that seemed at odds with the humble story she told about visiting relatives and making a new life in the West. On the 4th day, the storm finally began to show signs of breaking, the wind dropping from a howl to a moan, and the snow falling in larger, wetter flakes that suggested the end was near. Caleb was outside splitting wood behind the cabin, taking advantage of the brief lull to replenish their supply when he saw the riders approaching across the white landscape. 4 men on horseback, picking their way carefully across the frozen ground, but riding in a formation that set off every instinct he had developed during 3 years of military service and a lifetime of frontier living. They were spread out in a line rather than grouped together for warmth and companionship, their rifles clearly visible in saddle scabbards, their manner suggesting men who expected trouble and were prepared to deal with it harshly. Something in their approach, the deliberate way they scanned the terrain and the professional competence of their movements, told Caleb that these were not ordinary travelers seeking shelter from the storm. These were men with a purpose, and that purpose likely involved the woman who called herself Mary Walsh. He set down his axe carefully and moved casually toward the cabin, calling softly to Daniel to come inside. The boy, who had been playing in the snow near the porch and building elaborate snow fortifications for an imaginary army, looked up and saw his father's expression. Without argument or question, he dropped his snowball and ran for the door with the kind of immediate obedience that frontier children learned early for their own survival. "Jeremiah," Caleb called as he entered the cabin, his voice carrying the quiet urgency that both his father and son recognized as a signal for serious attention. "Visitors coming. 4 riders." The old man was immediately alert, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle that hung in a place of honor above the fireplace. In his 71 years, he had learned to read the signs that separated friendly visitors from potential threats, and his son's tone told him everything he needed to know about which category these riders fell into. "How many again?" he asked, already moving to check the weapon and ensure it was loaded and ready. 4, riding like they expect trouble and are ready to make some if they don't find what they're looking for. Mary Walsh, who had been sitting quietly by the fire reading one of Daniel's school books and seeming to enjoy the simple domestic tranquility of the cabin, looked up sharply at the exchange between father and son. For just an instant, before she could control her expression, Caleb saw something in her face that confirmed his worst suspicions about her true identity and the nature of the trouble that had brought her to their door. This was not surprise at the news of approaching strangers. This was recognition and fear, and the kind of resigned acceptance that came with knowing that a reckoning long delayed had finally arrived. "Mrs. Walsh," he said quietly, his voice carrying both authority and a demand for honesty that brooked no further deception, "is there something you need to tell us before those men reach our door?" Before she could answer, the sound of hoofbeats stopping outside the cabin made the decision for her. Heavy boots tramped across the wooden porch with the confidence of men accustomed to having doors open quickly and without question. A fist pounded on the door with the kind of authority that came from never having been refused anything. "Open up!" a voice called from outside, cultured and educated, but carrying undertones of steel that suggested patience was not among the speaker's virtues. "We're looking for someone, and we have reason to believe she might be here." Caleb looked directly at the woman who had called herself Mary Walsh, whose face had gone pale again, but this time not from cold or injury, but from the kind of fear that came with facing consequences long delayed. The moment had arrived when pretense would no longer suffice and the truth would have to be spoken, regardless of the cost. "Mrs. Walsh?" he asked one final time, giving her an opportunity to explain before circumstances forced revelations that might prove costly for everyone involved. "My name," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of truths too dangerous to speak but too important to conceal any longer, "is Isabella Sinclair, and those men outside have come here to kill me." The pounding on the door came again, more insistent this time, each blow echoing through the cabin like gunshots that promised real violence to follow. The men outside had positioned themselves with professional competence around the small building, cutting off all possible escape routes with the kind of tactical awareness that spoke of military training and considerable experience in matters of life and death. "We know you're in there," the cultured voice called again, its educated tones carrying undertones of steel that suggested patience was not among the speaker's virtues. "Open the door and nobody gets hurt. We just want to talk to the lady about a family matter." Jeremiah had already moved to the side window, his weathered hands steady on the rifle that had served him well through 3 decades of frontier life and Indian fighting. Through a gap in the heavy wooden shutters, he could see 4 men positioned around the cabin with the kind of professional spacing that eliminated blind spots and created overlapping fields of fire. "They've got us surrounded proper," he reported quietly to his son, his voice carrying the calm assessment of a man who had faced death before and found it less frightening than the prospect of failing to protect his family. "These aren't ranch hands or drifters looking for easy money. These are professionals, military trained by the look of their positioning." Isabella Sinclair rose from her chair by the fire, and for the first time since Caleb had found her half frozen in the snow, he saw not the helpless victim she had appeared to be, but someone else entirely. Someone who belonged to a world of calculated violence and sophisticated brutality. Someone who carried herself with the unconscious authority of those born to wealth and power, even when that power was built on blood and suffering. The transformation was remarkable and unsettling. Gone was the grateful invalid who had accepted their charity with gracious politeness. In her place stood a woman who assessed the tactical situation with the same professional competence as the men outside, whose gray eyes showed no surprise at finding herself the target of armed killers, whose bearing suggested she had faced such situations before and survived them. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carrying genuine regret, mixed with the kind of steely resolve that came from facing death before and finding the courage to stand against it. "I never meant for you to be involved in this. I thought I had lost them in the storm, that the trail had gone cold in the blizzard." "Who are they?" Caleb demanded, checking his own weapons while keeping one eye on Daniel, who had instinctively moved to the back corner of the cabin, where a heavy oak chest offered some protection from stray bullets. The boy's face was pale but determined, showing the kind of courage that made his father proud even as it broke his heart to see such bravery necessary in one so young. "They work for my family," Isabella said simply, as if that explanation could possibly suffice for the armed professionals outside who seemed prepared to kill anyone who stood between them and their objective. "My brother sent them to bring me back to New York, to face family justice for my betrayal of blood loyalty, or to kill me if I refused to come quietly." The casual way she spoke of her own murder, as if it were a business transaction rather than the ending of a human life, sent a chill through Caleb that had nothing to do with the winter cold still seeping through the cabin walls despite the roaring fire. "Your brother wants you dead?" Daniel asked from his corner, his young voice steady despite the fear that Caleb could see in his eyes. At 11, the boy had already learned that the world could be a harsh and unforgiving place, but this was his first direct encounter with the kind of casual evil that some people embraced as a way of life. Isabella's laugh was bitter as winter wind, carrying notes of pain and disillusionment that spoke of betrayals too deep to heal. My brother wants many people dead, Daniel. The difference is he usually gets what he wants. He has the money and connections to make problems disappear permanently, along with anyone foolish enough to become inconvenient to his business interests. Outside, the voices were growing impatient, and Caleb could hear the sound of men moving around the cabin, testing windows and checking for weaknesses in their defenses. The professional killers were conducting a methodical assessment of the building, looking for the best points of entry and the most effective ways to neutralize resistance. Soon they would stop asking politely and start making demands with bullets. "Start from the beginning," Caleb said, positioning himself at the front window where he could watch the main approach while keeping Isabella in sight. "Who is your family and why do they want you dead? What did you do to earn this kind of attention?" Isabella moved to the fireplace, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the rough stone mantelpiece. In the flickering light of the flames, Caleb could see that she was older than he had first thought, perhaps 33 or 34, with the kind of refined features that came from generations of careful breeding and inherited privilege. But there were lines around her eyes that spoke of suffering, and a hardness in her expression that suggested she had seen more of life's brutal realities than most society women ever encountered. "My name is Isabella Ashford Sinclair," she began, each word seeming to cost her something precious, as if speaking the truth were a form of self-inflicted wound. "My family owns banks, railroads, mining operations, and a dozen other business interests from New York to San Francisco. We are, as they say in polite society, old money with deep roots and extensive influence." Jeremiah snorted from his position at the window, his attention divided between the conversation and the movements of their besiegers. "Old money built on what? There's always blood under that kind of wealth. Always someone who paid the real price for all that comfort and privilege." "More than you know," Isabella agreed grimly, her voice carrying the weight of knowledge that had clearly cost her whatever innocence she might once have possessed. "My great-grandfather made the family fortune during the Civil War, selling weapons and supplies to both sides and profiting handsomely from the misery of 500,000 dead Americans. Every generation since has found new ways to increase that wealth, regardless of the cost in human lives or human dignity." She moved away from the fireplace, pacing the small confines of the cabin like a caged animal desperate for escape, but aware that none was possible. "I married Thomas Sinclair 3 years ago, thinking I could escape the family business by creating a life separate from their influence. Thomas was a federal judge, a good man who believed in justice and the law, and the possibility that America could become something better than what it was." "What happened to him?" Caleb asked, though he suspected from her tone and manner that he already knew the answer. "My brother Cornelius had him killed," Isabella said flatly, the words falling into the cabin like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of implication that spread outward from the simple statement. "Thomas was investigating corruption in the territorial courts, following a trail of bribery and intimidation that led directly back to Ashford money and Ashford influence. When he refused to drop the investigation despite increasingly serious threats, Cornelius decided he had become too dangerous to live. The shooting started without warning, ending any further discussion of family histories or criminal conspiracies. The first bullet shattered the front window, sending glass fragments across the cabin floor like scattered diamonds that caught the firelight and reflected it in 1,000 tiny flames. Isabella threw herself behind the heavy oak table with movements that spoke of training and experience far beyond what any sheltered society woman should have possessed. Caleb rolled to his left, coming up behind the stone chimney with his rifle ready, while Jeremiah took cover at the side window and began returning fire with the methodical precision of a man who had been shooting at other human beings since before the Civil War began. The old man's first shot took one of the attackers center mass, dropping him instantly with the kind of accuracy that came from decades of practice and the steady nerves of someone who had faced death too many times to be intimidated by it. Daniel, following instructions that had been drilled into him since he was old enough to understand the dangers of frontier life, crawled behind the oak chest and made himself as small as possible. But even from his protected position, the boy watched everything with the wide eyes of someone seeing the adult world revealed in all its brutal complexity. How many? Caleb called to his father between the sharp cracks of rifle fire that echoed through the cabin and the answering reports from outside that spoke of professional weapons handled by men who knew their business. Four, like you said, Jeremiah replied, pausing to reload with movements so practiced they seemed automatic. But they're spread out good, and they know what they're doing. These aren't amateurs looking for quick money. Another window exploded inward as a bullet found its mark, and Caleb could hear the sound of heavy boots on the wooden porch as at least one of the attackers moved closer to the cabin. These men were not content to conduct a siege from a comfortable distance. They were preparing for a direct assault that would bring the fight to close quarters where superior numbers might prove decisive. Isabella, Caleb called, using her real name for the first time since she had revealed her identity. Can you shoot? In answer, she appeared from behind the table with a small but deadly-looking pistol in her hand, the kind of weapon that wealthy women sometimes carried for protection in dangerous cities, but rarely knew how to use effectively. But the way she held it, the confidence in her stance, and the steadiness of her grip despite the chaos around her, told Caleb that this was no ornamental accessory carried for show. Better than most men, she said simply, and proved it a moment later when one of the attackers appeared at the broken window, his rifle raised and ready to fire. Her shot took him center mass, the bullet finding its mark with the kind of precision that came from extensive training and considerable practical experience. The man dropped without a sound, his weapon clattering to the floor as his body crumpled in the window frame. Where in hell did a society woman learn to shoot like that? Jeremiah demanded as he took careful aim at another target, his voice carrying admiration mixed with suspicion. The same place she learned to speak 4 languages and manage a fortune worth millions of dollars, Isabella replied grimly as she reloaded her weapon with smooth efficiency. My family believes in preparing their children for any eventuality, including the possibility that someday they might need to kill people who threaten family interests or family secrets. The battle continued for nearly 20 minutes, a deadly game of movement and position that gradually favored the defenders despite their numerical disadvantage. The attackers had expected to find a helpless woman and perhaps an old man and a child who could be easily intimidated or overwhelmed. Instead, they faced determined resistance from people who knew the ground, who were fighting for their lives, and who had the advantage of solid cover and interior lines of communication. When the shooting finally stopped, 3 of the 4 attackers lay dead in the snow around the cabin, their blood steaming in the cold air as it melted the white powder beneath their bodies. The 4th man had disappeared into the storm, presumably to report his failure to whoever had sent them and to request reinforcements for what had proven to be a more difficult task than originally anticipated. The cabin itself was a ruin of broken glass and splintered wood, with bullet holes in the walls that let in streams of cold air and reminded them all how close death had come to visiting their door. But its occupants were alive and unharmed, bound together now by the shared experience of violence and the knowledge that they had trusted each other with their lives and found that trust justified. This won't be the end of it, Isabella said as they surveyed the damage and began the grim task of checking the bodies of their attackers for anything that might provide information about their enemies or their intentions. My brother will send more men when these don't return, professionals who won't make the same mistakes these men made. Caleb knelt beside one of the dead men, searching through his pockets for anything that might provide intelligence about who had sent them or what they had been ordered to accomplish. He found nothing except expensive weapons, quality clothing that spoke of Eastern manufacturers, and a considerable amount of cash and gold coins that confirmed these had been hired killers rather than ordinary criminals motivated by desperation or opportunity. How much time do we have? He asked Isabella as he finished his methodical search of the bodies. Not much, she replied, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who understood the resources and determination of their enemies. The survivor will have to reach the nearest telegraph office to report what happened here and request assistance. That's probably Bear Creek, which means we have perhaps 6 hours before the next group arrives, and they'll come in greater numbers with better information about what they're facing. Then we need to leave, Jeremiah said practically, already moving to gather the weapons and supplies they would need for what was clearly going to be a very dangerous journey. Load what we can carry, take the best horses, and put as much distance between us and this place as possible before they come back with enough men to make resistance impossible. But Caleb was thinking beyond immediate survival, considering the larger implications of everything Isabella had told them about corruption and conspiracy that reached far beyond their small corner of Wyoming territory. For 5 years, he had accepted their loss of the ranch as the price of fighting a system too powerful and entrenched to defeat. Now he was learning that the system itself might be vulnerable if approached in the right way with the right evidence. "Where would we go?" he asked. "If your brother controls judges and politicians across the territory, if his influence reaches into territorial government and federal courts, where could we run that would be truly safe?" Isabella was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire as if she could see their future written in the dancing flames. When she spoke, her voice carried a resolution that had been missing during their earlier conversation, a determination that seemed to draw strength from the violence they had just survived. "We don't run," she said finally. "We fight back, but we fight smart. I have evidence that could destroy my brother and everyone who has helped him build his empire of corruption. Documents, financial records, correspondence that proves crimes going back for 20 years and implicates officials at the highest levels of territorial and federal government." "Where is this evidence?" Jeremiah asked skeptically, his experience with the wealthy and powerful making him doubt that such people would leave incriminating materials lying around where they could be easily discovered. "Hidden in a safe place, but not here in Wyoming," Isabella replied. "We would need to travel east, back into the heart of enemy territory, to retrieve it and find someone with enough integrity and independence to act on what it reveals." As they prepared to abandon the only home Daniel had ever known, Isabella reached into her traveling bag and withdrew a leather portfolio that had somehow survived both the storm and the gunfight. From it, she extracted several official-looking documents that bore the seals and signatures of territorial authority. "There's something else you need to know about your own family's history," she said, handing the papers to Jeremiah with an expression that combined regret and determination. "Something my husband discovered during his investigation into territorial court corruption." The old man took the documents with hands that trembled slightly, whether from age or emotion Caleb could not tell. As his eyes moved across the official language and legal terminology, his face grew pale and then flushed with an anger that seemed to burn from within. "This is our original land grant," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The deed to 12,000 acres that was supposed to be ours forever, guaranteed by territorial law and federal authority." "What does it say, grandfather?" Daniel asked, moving closer to examine the documents that seemed to have such profound meaning for the adults. Jeremiah's voice grew stronger as his anger built, fed by years of suppressed rage and the bitter knowledge of injustice. "It says the seizure of our land was illegal from beginning to end. The railroad claims were fraudulent, the court orders were issued by judges who had no jurisdiction, and the entire proceeding violated territorial law in ways that should have made it void from the moment it was filed." "Why didn't our lawyers catch this?" Caleb demanded, taking the documents from his father and reading them with growing amazement and fury. "Because your lawyers were paid to lose," Isabella said quietly. "Because the judges who heard your case had already been bought and the outcome decided before the first document was filed. The Ashford family needed that particular tract of land for a railroad spur that would increase the value of their mining operations in the Medicine Bow Mountains. Your ranch was simply in the way of their plans." The revelation hit Caleb like a physical blow, confirming suspicions he had carried for 5 years but had never been able to prove. The legal theft of their land, the destruction of everything his grandfather had built and his father had expanded. The graves they had been forced to abandon when lawyers and railroad men decided their property was worth more than their rights. "Why are you telling us this?" he asked Isabella, though part of him already suspected the answer and dreaded what it might mean for their immediate survival. "Because my brother Cornelius was the one who ordered the seizure," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of guilt by association and the knowledge that her family's crimes had destroyed innocent lives. "Because your family's suffering is part of the legacy of blood and corruption that I'm trying to escape. And because, if we're going to survive what's coming, we need to trust each other completely." They loaded their horses quickly and efficiently, taking only what they could carry and leaving behind everything that spoke of the peaceful life they had tried to build in the shadow of their losses. As they prepared to ride into an uncertain future, Caleb felt the weight of decisions settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. The storm was breaking as they left the cabin, the wind dropping from a howl to a moan, and the snow falling in larger, wetter flakes that suggested the worst of the weather was finally passing. They rode in single file through the deep drifts, following game trails and creek beds that would make tracking more difficult for their pursuers. Isabella, despite her obvious unfamiliarity with frontier conditions, proved to be a competent rider who adapted quickly to the demands of winter travel. Daniel rode close beside her, his natural kindness overcoming his shyness as he pointed out landmarks and explained the survival techniques his grandfather had taught him since he was old enough to sit a horse. For the first few hours, they traveled in relative quiet, each lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead and what they had left behind. But as the day wore on and the immediate danger receded somewhat, conversation began to flow more naturally between them. Isabella told them about her life in New York society, about balls and theaters and the artificial pleasures of wealth that had never quite satisfied her hunger for something more meaningful. Daniel, in turn, described life on the frontier, the harsh beauty of Wyoming seasons, and the satisfaction that came from building something with your own hands and making it prosper through hard work and determination. Gradually, as trust built between them, more personal revelations emerged. Isabella spoke of her marriage to Thomas Sinclair, of her hopes that love might provide an escape from the moral compromises that seemed to define her family's existence. Caleb found himself talking about Sarah, about the dreams they had shared for their son's future, and the bitter reality of losing her just when their life together seemed to be reaching its full promise. "She would have liked you," he found himself saying as they made camp that first night, the words emerging without conscious thought. Sarah always believed that people could change, that circumstances didn't have to define character. "I hope I would have been worthy of her approval," Isabella replied, and something in her voice suggested that the good opinion of a frontier woman she had never met had become important to her in ways she didn't fully understand. The attack came on the second day, when they had begun to hope that perhaps they had gained enough distance to discourage immediate pursuit. They were crossing a narrow canyon when the shooting started, muzzle flashes appearing from behind rocks and trees in a coordinated assault that spoke of careful planning and professional execution. Magnus Steele had caught up with them, bringing 8 men who knew their business and had positioned themselves to create a killing field that would eliminate all witnesses to whatever crimes the Ashford family needed to keep hidden. The initial volley killed Caleb's horse and sent him tumbling into the snow, while bullets whined off rocks around their heads like angry hornets seeking blood. Jeremiah, riding slightly ahead, immediately wheeled his horse and charged directly into the ambush, his rifle barking as he sought to draw fire away from Daniel and create an opportunity for escape. The old man's desperate courage bought them precious seconds, but the cost was terrible. Multiple bullets found their mark, and he tumbled from his saddle with blood spreading across the snow beneath his still form. "Grandfather!" Daniel cried out, his young voice breaking with anguish and terror at seeing the man who had raised him struck down by strangers whose faces he couldn't even see through the gun smoke and swirling snow. The battle that followed was desperate and chaotic, a running fight through terrain that offered little cover and less comfort. Isabella proved her worth again and again, her accurate shooting and tactical sense helping to keep them alive as they fought their way out of the trap that had been set for them. But when the immediate danger had passed and they could finally tend to their wounded, the cost of survival became clear. Jeremiah was still alive, but barely, his breathing labored and his face gray with shock and blood loss. The bullets had done terrible damage, and even Caleb's medical training offered little hope for recovery without proper facilities and professional care. "Leave me," the old man whispered when he understood the extent of his injuries. "Take the boy and run. This fight is bigger than any of us now." "We're not leaving you," Caleb said firmly, though his heart broke at the pain in his father's eyes. "We'll find a way to get you help, get you somewhere safe to heal." But even as he spoke the words, Caleb knew they might be empty comfort. They were hundreds of miles from any real medical assistance, winter was far from over, and their enemies were closing in with resources that dwarfed anything he could bring to bear against such opposition. That night, as they huddled in an abandoned miner's cabin, While Jeremiah fought for life and Isabella kept watch for pursuers, Daniel made a discovery that changed everything they thought they understood about the forces arrayed against them. Hidden among some old newspapers used to chink the cabin walls was a letter addressed to Thomas Sinclair, postmarked just days before his death. Isabella opened it with trembling fingers, recognizing her late husband's name, and as she read the contents, her face went white with shock and rage. "What is it?" Caleb asked, seeing her distress. "Evidence," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Proof that my family's crimes go even deeper than I knew." This letter is from a doctor in Bear Creek, warning Thomas about contamination in the water supply from illegal mining operations. It mentions specific cases of poisoning, including, her voice broke as she reached the crucial passage, including the death of Sarah Thornton, wife of Caleb Thornton, who died investigating the connection between the mine runoff and the illness that was killing her patients. The words hung in the cabin air like a curse, confirming what Caleb had long suspected, but had never been able to prove. Sarah's death had not been the result of natural disease or unfortunate exposure. She had been murdered, as surely as if someone had put a gun to her head, killed by the very people she was trying to help through her exposure to contaminated water that the Ashford family knew was deadly, but continued to allow into the local supply. "They killed her," Daniel said quietly, his young voice carrying an understanding that was terrible in its clarity. "They killed Mama because she was trying to help people." Caleb felt the world tilt beneath him. All these years of self-blame, of wondering if he'd been a good enough doctor, protective enough husband, the guilt that had eaten at him like acid, all of it based on a lie. Sarah hadn't died from his failure to save her. She'd been murdered for her compassion. The rage that followed wasn't just fury, it was the terrible clarity of a man who finally understood what he was truly fighting against. But beneath the anger was something else. Something that might have been relief at finally understanding the true scope of what they were fighting against. "Now we know," he said finally, his voice carrying a quiet determination that somehow seemed more dangerous than any amount of shouting or threats. "Now we know exactly what kind of people we're dealing with and what they're capable of doing to innocent families who get in their way." The next morning brought news that changed their situation dramatically. A rider approached under a flag of truce, carrying a message from Magnus Steel that was both threat and opportunity. Daniel had been taken during the night, kidnapped from a place they had thought secure, and was being held as leverage to ensure Isabella's cooperation. The terms were simple: she would surrender herself and the evidence she carried, or the boy would die in ways that would make his grandfather's battlefield wounds seem merciful by comparison. They had 24 hours to decide, and Steele's men would be watching to ensure no attempt was made to mount a rescue. "It's my fault," Isabella said, her voice broken with guilt and self-recrimination. "I brought this evil to your door, and now an innocent child is paying the price for my family's sins." "No," Caleb said firmly, his mind already working on possibilities and probabilities that might offer hope where none seemed to exist. "We're all in this together now, for better or worse, but we're not giving up. And we're not trading your life for Daniel's. We're going to find another way." As they prepared for what might be their final confrontation with forces that seemed to possess every advantage, Caleb found himself thinking about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A chance encounter in a blizzard. A woman whose true identity had revealed the scope of corruption that infected everything they had believed about justice and law. Now his son's life hung in the balance, and their only hope lay in outmaneuvering enemies who had spent generations perfecting the art of destroying anyone who threatened their interests. But they had something the Ashford family had never understood: the willingness to sacrifice everything for principles that couldn't be bought or intimidated. And perhaps, in the end, that might prove to be enough to tip the balance in favor of justice over power, truth over corruption, and the simple human decency that had built America over the sophisticated evil that threatened to destroy it from within. The storm clouds were gathering again as they rode toward an uncertain future, but this time Caleb welcomed the coming tempest. Sometimes the only way to clear the air was to let the thunder roll and trust that when the lightning stopped flashing, the world would be a cleaner place for honest people to build their lives. The dawn sky above Denver was the color of old blood, stained crimson by coal smoke and industrial fires that never seemed to dim in this monument to American progress. The city sprawled before them like a vast organism, feeding on the wealth torn from mountain valleys and prairie grasslands, all brick and steel and iron rails that carried the treasure of the territories eastward to cities where men in fine clothes made decisions about other people's lives without ever seeing their faces or knowing their names. To Caleb Thornton, riding through the outskirts with Isabella beside him and his heart heavy with worry for his captive son, Denver looked less like civilization than like a fortress designed to protect accumulated wealth from the justice it had so long evaded. The buildings rose higher than anything he had ever seen, casting shadows that seemed to swallow the morning light and leave the streets below in a perpetual twilight that spoke of power exercised without accountability. They had been traveling for 4 days since leaving Jeremiah in the care of Dr. Marcus Webb, a frontier physician whose skill with battlefield wounds offered their only hope of keeping the old man alive long enough for proper healing to begin. The parting had been harder than Caleb could have imagined, watching his father struggle against injuries that might prove fatal while knowing he was riding toward dangers that could orphan Daniel completely and leave 3 generations of Thornton men dead in the service of a justice that might prove as elusive as morning mist. But there had been no choice, no alternative to pursuing their enemies into the heart of their power if they hoped to save the boy and expose the truth about decades of corruption that had poisoned everything from territorial courts to federal appointments. The evidence Isabella carried represented more than proof of specific crimes. It was documentation of a system so thoroughly corrupted that honest men could find no recourse within its boundaries. Isabella had guided them through backcountry routes that avoided the main roads where Magnus Steele's remaining men might be watching for travelers matching their description. Her knowledge of such things continued to surprise and occasionally disturb Caleb, serving as a constant reminder of the world she came from, where criminal activity was simply another form of business enterprise and violence was a tool to be employed when other methods proved insufficient for achieving desired objectives. The closer they came to Denver, the more obvious became the scope of Ashford influence in the region. Freight wagons bearing the family crest moved along every major road, their guards armed and alert for threats to valuable cargo. Railroad lines that converged on the city like steel arteries carried cars marked with symbols that Isabella recognized as subsidiary companies controlled by the family's financial empire. Even the smallest settlements they passed showed evidence of Ashford presence. Banks, trading posts, and mining supply companies that served as tentacles of an economic organism that touched every aspect of life in the territories. There, Isabella said now, pointing toward a massive brick structure that dominated the downtown district like a cathedral dedicated to the worship of accumulated wealth and inherited privilege. The Ashford Building. My brother maintains the entire top 2 floors as his personal office and residence when he's conducting business in the Western Territories. Caleb studied the building through field glasses he had taken from one of the dead assassins who had attacked their cabin in what seemed like another lifetime. 6 stories of solid construction with narrow windows designed more for defense than illumination, it looked exactly like what it was, the fortress of a man who had made countless enemies during his rise to power and needed protection from the consequences of his own actions. The structure occupied an entire city block, its walls rising directly from the sidewalks without the setbacks or decorative elements that might have softened its forbidding appearance. Guards were visible at every entrance, men whose bearing and positioning spoke of military training and considerable experience in matters of violence and intimidation. This was not a building designed to welcome casual visitors or accommodate unexpected guests. "How do we get inside?" Caleb asked, though he suspected the answer would involve risks that might prove fatal to all of them. "The front door," Isabella replied with a calmness that he found both reassuring and deeply unsettling. "I'm still officially a member of the Ashford family, despite my recent difficulties with family policy. Cornelius will want to see me in person before he decides exactly how I'm going to die. He's always been theatrical about such things, enjoyed the dramatic gesture that reinforces his power over other people while satisfying his need for personal revenge. And Daniel will be somewhere in that building, probably on one of the upper floors where escape would be impossible, even if he managed to get free of his guards." Isabella's voice carried the flat certainty of someone who understood her brother's methods intimately, gained through years of watching him eliminate obstacles to his ambitions with the kind of systematic cruelty that he seemed to genuinely enjoy. Cornelius likes to keep his leverage close at hand, where he can produce it quickly if negotiations become difficult or if he needs to demonstrate his serious intentions to doubting subordinates. They left their horses at Murphy's livery stable, a public establishment several blocks from the financial district where the animals would blend in with dozens of others belonging to travelers, business visitors, and local residents who couldn't afford private accommodations for their mounts. Caleb paid the Irish proprietor enough gold to ensure excellent care, but not so much as to attract unwanted attention or create memorable impressions that might later prove dangerous. Walking through the streets of Denver in their travel-worn frontier clothing, they looked exactly like what hundreds of other visitors to the growing metropolis appeared to be. People from the territories seeking opportunity, justice, or simply the chance to conduct business in the unofficial capital of the Mountain West. But beneath their ordinary appearance, both carried weapons and a determination that had been hardened by weeks of pursuit, gunfights, and the growing knowledge that failure would mean death for an innocent boy whose only crime had been offering kindness to a stranger found dying in a blizzard. Denver sprawled before them with the raw ambition of American expansion. Buildings rising from prairie lots, muddy frontier tracks transformed into streets bearing electric lights and telephone wires. Infrastructure built to serve serious wealth and power. But beneath the veneer of progress, Caleb recognized the same brutal realities that plagued the territories. The workers who built these monuments to prosperity lived in squalid tenements that never saw morning sunlight, while the profits from their labor flowed upward to men who would never dirty their hands with honest work or honest sweat. It was the same system that had destroyed his family and countless others, simply operating on a larger and more sophisticated scale. The lobby of the Ashford building was designed to impress and intimidate visitors in equal measure, with marble floors that echoed every footstep and elaborate crystal chandeliers that cast more shadows than light while demonstrating the owner's ability to import luxury from the finest European craftsmen. Behind an ornate mahogany desk that probably cost more than most men earned in a year, sat a man whose expensive clothing couldn't quite disguise the fact that his primary qualifications for employment were size, meanness, and the kind of practiced violence that made reasonable conversation unnecessary. Gold leaf lettering on the wall behind him spelled out the various Ashford business enterprises in script elegant enough for a wedding invitation: banking, railroads, mining, territorial development, import and export trading, and several other categories that probably served as respectable fronts for less legitimate activities. The overall effect was designed to remind visitors that they were entering the domain of genuine power, the kind that shaped territories and influenced federal policy through methods that rarely appeared in newspaper accounts or congressional records. "We're here to see Cornelius Ashford," Isabella announced, her voice carrying the unconscious authority of someone who had been raised to expect immediate obedience and had never learned to doubt that doors would open quickly when she required them to do so. "Tell him his sister has come home to discuss certain family business matters that require immediate attention." And the reception clerk looked up with the kind of practiced skepticism that came from turning away dozens of people daily who claimed urgent business with one of the most powerful men in the territory. His eyes moved over their frontier clothing and trail-worn appearance with obvious dismissal, clearly categorizing them as the sort of provincial visitors who deserved nothing more than polite discouragement and rapid ejection from premises reserved for their betters. But something in Isabella's bearing, the unconscious authority that came with inherited wealth and social position that couldn't be faked or purchased, made him pause and reconsider his automatic refusal. There was also something in her gray eyes that suggested patience was not among her notable virtues, and that persistence in refusing her request might prove personally hazardous for reasons he didn't fully understand, but instinctively feared. "Mr. Ashford is not receiving unscheduled visitors today," he began, but Isabella cut him off with a gesture that somehow conveyed both dismissal and threat in a single fluid movement of her gloved hand. "He'll receive me," she said simply, her voice carrying the kind of quiet certainty that came from never having been denied anything she truly wanted. "Unless you'd prefer to explain to him personally why you turned away a member of his immediate family on a matter of urgent business importance that affects family interests throughout the territorial system. The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and the clerk's training in recognizing genuine authority overcame his instructions to discourage uninvited guests who might waste valuable time or create security complications. Within minutes, they were being escorted to a private elevator operated by another large man whose watchful eyes and careful positioning suggested his duties extended far beyond simple mechanical operation to include personal protection and, if necessary, immediate violence. The elevator itself was a marvel of modern engineering and conspicuous consumption, with brass fittings that gleamed like gold and mahogany paneling that spoke of craftsmen whose skills commanded premium prices. But Caleb noticed that the operator kept one hand near a concealed weapon throughout their ascent, and that the control mechanisms were designed to prevent passengers from operating the device independently, ensuring that visitors could only reach authorized floors with explicit permission from building security. The ride to the top floor passed in tense silence, each second bringing them deeper into enemy territory where discovery would mean immediate death for both of them and probably prolonged torture for Daniel before his eventual murder served as an example to others who might consider interfering with Ashford business interests. Caleb kept his hand near his concealed revolver while trying to appear relaxed and unthreatening, knowing that violence might be their only option if Isabella's plan to gain access through family privilege failed to work as intended. The elevator opened directly into a reception area that combined luxury with functionality in ways that spoke of enormous wealth tastefully displayed but not flaunted with the crude ostentation of newly rich men who needed to prove their status through obvious excess. Persian carpets covered polished hardwood floors that gleamed with the kind of finish that required daily attention from skilled craftsmen, while oil paintings in elaborate golden frames depicted pastoral European scenes that had nothing to do with the harsh realities of territorial life, but served to remind visitors that they were in the presence of culture and refinement. Furniture that had clearly been imported from the finest European craftsmen provided seating for visitors who would never be kept waiting long enough to appreciate such amenities, while fresh flowers in crystal vases added touches of color and fragrance that served as additional demonstrations of the owner's ability to command luxury even in a frontier city where such things required considerable expense and logistical complexity. Isabella. The voice came from behind them, cultured and educated, but carrying undertones of steel that suggested patience was not among the speaker's notable virtues. How unexpected to see you here voluntarily after all the trouble you've caused for family business interests. And how very foolish of you to come here without the protection that distance and anonymity might have provided for whatever remained of your natural lifespan. Cornelius Ashford stood in the doorway of what was obviously his private office, a man of perhaps 40 years whose expensive clothing and careful grooming couldn't quite disguise the predatory intelligence that marked him as someone who had never hesitated to destroy anything that stood between him and his objectives. He was taller than Caleb had expected from Isabella's descriptions, with the kind of physical presence that commanded attention even in rooms full of powerful men. And there was something in his pale eyes that suggested he genuinely enjoyed the process of breaking other people's spirits before ending their lives. His suit was perfectly tailored from fabric that probably cost more than most families spent on clothing in a decade, while his shoes gleamed with the kind of polish that spoke of servants whose only job was maintaining their employer's appearance. Everything about him proclaimed wealth, power, and the kind of sophisticated cruelty that could destroy lives with telephone calls and legal documents rather than crude violence, though Caleb suspected he was equally capable of more direct methods when they served his purposes better. "Hello, Cornelius," Isabella replied with a calmness that Caleb found remarkable, given the circumstances and the obvious danger they faced simply by being in the same room with a man who had ordered the deaths of everyone they had ever cared about. "I believe you have something that belongs to my friends here. A boy you've taken for reasons that have nothing to do with legitimate family business, and everything to do with your paranoid fear that your crimes might finally be exposed to public scrutiny and legal investigation." "Crimes?" Cornelius smiled with the kind of amusement that never reached his eyes and suggested that he found accusations of wrongdoing simply entertaining rather than threatening or offensive. Such a harsh word for what others might call innovative business practices designed to maximize return on investment while minimizing regulatory interference. But yes, I do have the child, and he's quite safe for the moment, receiving better care and nutrition than he's probably accustomed to in his rustic frontier environment. Whether he continues to enjoy such excellent treatment depends entirely on your willingness to be reasonable about certain family obligations you've been neglecting during your misguided crusade for what you apparently consider justice. Where is he? Caleb demanded, his voice carrying the quiet threat of a man who had reached the limits of his patience with civilized conversation and legal niceties that served only to delay necessary action while innocent people suffered. Cornelius turned his attention to Caleb for the first time, his gaze moving over the frontier clothing and weathered features with the kind of dismissive assessment that wealthy men reserve for people they considered beneath serious consideration or legitimate concern. And you must be the cowboy who's been causing so much difficulty for our various business operations throughout the territorial system, he said with obvious amusement at what he clearly regarded as a mismatch between his sophisticated resources and his opponent's primitive capabilities. Caleb Thornton, isn't it? The man whose wife died from contaminated water that our mining operations may have contributed to in some small and largely unforeseeable way, though of course our legal counsel maintains that any such connection would be impossible to prove in a properly constituted court of law. The casual acknowledgement of Sarah's murder, spoken as if it were a minor business inconvenience rather than the deliberate ending of an innocent life, sent rage shooting through Caleb like electricity through copper wire. His hand moved instinctively toward his concealed weapon, but Isabella's slight gesture warned him that premature violence would only ensure their failure and Daniel's death without accomplishing anything constructive toward their ultimate objectives. More than contributed, he said quietly, his voice carrying controlled fury that was somehow more threatening than any amount of shouting or obvious anger would have been. You killed her deliberately, systematically, as part of a pattern of criminal behavior that includes murdering Isabella's husband when he got too close to the truth about your illegal operations and corrupted officials. Truth is such a relative concept in complex business environments, don't you think? Cornelius moved deeper into the reception area, his movements casual but calculated to maintain distance from his visitors while keeping potential escape routes available and ensuring that any violence would favor his position rather than theirs. Our mining operations follow all applicable territorial regulations and federal guidelines, operating under licenses properly obtained through established legal channels. If some people choose to build their homes and raise their families near industrial sites, that necessarily involve certain environmental impacts, and then suffer unfortunate health consequences as a result of their poor judgment, surely that represents a matter of personal responsibility rather than corporate liability. The legal sophistication of his denial, the way he used technical language and procedural complexities to obscure moral responsibility while protecting himself from criminal prosecution, reminded Caleb of everything he had learned to hate about a system that protected men like Cornelius while destroying families like his own through methods that were legal but fundamentally unjust. But beneath his anger was a cold calculation that had been growing during their journey to Denver, a recognition that emotional responses would only serve their enemies' purposes while accomplishing nothing constructive toward rescuing Daniel or exposing the truth about decades of systematic corruption. We're not here to debate legal technicalities or discuss the finer points of territorial business regulation, Isabella said, taking control of the conversation before it could escalate into violence that would end their mission before it had really begun. I propose we conduct a civilized exchange of assets. The documentation in my possession, evidence regarding certain family business irregularities, in return for the child's immediate and unconditional release, plus your guarantee that the Thornton family will be left alone to rebuild their lives without further interference from any source connected to Ashford Enterprises. Ah, yes, the famous evidence, Cornelius replied with obvious amusement at what he clearly regarded as a pathetic attempt at extortion by people who fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the forces they were challenging. Documents and correspondence that allegedly prove various business irregularities extending back several years and involving numerous respected members of territorial society. I confess myself curious about exactly what your late husband managed to gather before his most unfortunate accident during that routine inspection of mining operations. Murder, Isabella corrected flatly, her voice carrying the kind of cold certainty that came from absolute knowledge of her brother's guilt in her husband's death. Thomas was murdered on your direct orders because he was investigating corruption that would have sent half the territorial government to federal prison if his findings had become public knowledge. Accident, Cornelius insisted with the kind of calm certainty that suggested he had told the lie so often that he had convinced himself it represented actual truth rather than convenient fiction. A tragic fall from his horse during a routine inspection of mining operations in treacherous mountain country. These things happen with unfortunate frequency in dangerous terrain, especially when people insist on traveling alone in areas where they're unfamiliar with local conditions and potential hazards. The casual dismissal of her husband's murder, the reduction of deliberate assassination to mere accident through careful word choice and practiced denial, was clearly designed to provoke Isabella into some emotional response that would give Cornelius a psychological advantage in their deadly negotiation. But she had learned to control her reactions during years of dealing with family members who regarded cruelty as entertainment and violence as simply another business tool to be employed when circumstances required its use. It was then that Elizabeth Ashford entered from a side door that Caleb hadn't noticed, moving with the same unconscious authority that marked her sister, but carrying herself with an air of barely controlled tension that suggested significant internal conflict about the situation unfolding before her. She was perhaps 28, several years younger than Isabella, with the same refined features and expensive clothing that marked her as a member of one of America's wealthiest families. But there was something different in her expression, a combination of guilt and determination that suggested she had not come simply to witness her sister's destruction, but possibly to participate in preventing it. "Hello, Isabella," she said quietly, her voice carrying undertones of regret and what might have been relief at finally having an opportunity to speak directly with the sister who had become the family's most dangerous enemy. "I was hoping you might find your way here eventually, though I confess I didn't expect you to walk voluntarily into what Cornelius has prepared as your final resting place." "Elizabeth," Isabella replied with obvious surprise, mixed with wariness about her younger sister's intentions and loyalties in the developing confrontation. "I didn't expect to find you here. I thought you were still in New York, safely distant from the kind of business activities that require personal supervision." "Someone needs to represent the family's conscience in these matters," Elizabeth said with a bitter smile that suggested she had few illusions about her own effectiveness in moderating her brother's behavior. "Though I'm afraid my influence on family policy has proven somewhat limited when it comes to matters involving violence and criminal activity." Cornelius watched this reunion with obvious irritation, clearly annoyed by complications that threatened to interfere with his carefully planned confrontation and ultimate revenge against the sister who had dared to challenge family authority by exposing their business methods to potential legal scrutiny. "How touching," he said with sarcasm thick enough to cut with a knife. "A family reunion in the midst of serious business negotiations. But I'm afraid sentiment will have to wait until we've resolved the practical matters that brought us together. Isabella, the evidence you mentioned, I believe it's time to produce it and demonstrate exactly what you think you possess that might threaten legitimate business interests." Isabella reached into her coat and withdrew the leather portfolio that had somehow survived weeks of pursuit, gunfights, and the constant threat of discovery by enemies who would kill anyone to prevent its contents from becoming public knowledge. The portfolio itself was worn from travel and stained with what might have been blood, but the documents inside remained intact and potentially devastating to anyone whose criminal activities were documented in their pages. "Financial records," she said simply, opening the portfolio to reveal page after page of correspondence, financial statements, and official documents bearing seals and signatures that would be recognized by any federal prosecutor. Correspondence between family representatives and territorial officials detailing the specific amounts paid for specific favorable rulings in matters involving land grants, mining rights, and railroad construction contracts. Documentation of bribery and corruption extending from territorial courts to federal appointments, with enough detail to send dozens of people to federal prison for terms that would effectively end their lives. Cornelius studied the documents with the kind of intense interest that suggested he understood exactly how dangerous such evidence could prove to someone whose power depended entirely on keeping certain activities hidden from public scrutiny and legal investigation. His face remained calm, but Caleb noticed that his hands had begun to tremble slightly as he recognized the scope of what his sister had managed to gather during her husband's investigation. And in exchange for these alleged proofs of business misconduct, "You want what exactly?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer and had no intention of honoring any agreement that left potential witnesses alive to threaten family interests in the future. "The boy, unharmed and immediately released," Isabella replied, with the kind of calm precision that came from having thought through every aspect of the negotiation in advance. "Safe passage out of Denver for all three of us, with your personal guarantee that neither the Thornton family nor anyone associated with them will be pursued, threatened, or harmed in any way by any person or organization connected to Ashford business interests. Generous terms for someone who's caused so much trouble for legitimate family business enterprises," Cornelius observed with obvious amusement at what he clearly regarded as naive expectations about his willingness to honor agreements with people he intended to kill. "But I'm afraid the situation has become considerably more complicated since you began this misguided crusade for justice and legal reform. The boy isn't the only leverage I possess in this negotiation, and recent developments have provided me with additional resources that I believe will prove decisive in reaching a satisfactory conclusion to our family difficulties." He gestured toward his office, and two men emerged carrying a figure that made Caleb's heart stop with recognition and terror that threatened to overwhelm his ability to think clearly about tactical necessities and strategic possibilities. Jeremiah Thornton, his face gray with pain and blood loss, was barely conscious and obviously near death from wounds that had been deliberately reopened during transportation from whatever hiding place Cornelius's men had discovered through methods that probably involved considerable violence and intimidation of innocent people. "We found him in Dr. Webb's clinic in Cheyenne," Cornelius explained with obvious satisfaction at the shock and anguish his revelation had produced in his opponents. Amazing how helpful people can become when properly motivated to provide information about strangers who've been asking too many questions about family business activities and private affairs that are better kept confidential. "You bastard," Caleb breathed, his control finally slipping as he saw his father's condition and understood that their enemies had been ahead of them every step of the way, anticipating their moves and countering their strategies with resources that seemed unlimited by financial constraints or moral considerations. "He needs immediate medical attention or he's going to die, and his death will accomplish nothing except satisfying your need for personal revenge against people who never did you any real harm." "Yes, he probably will die," Cornelius agreed with the kind of clinical detachment that suggested other people's suffering was simply another factor to be calculated in his business equations and personal satisfaction. "Along with the boy, unless you are willing to be considerably more reasonable about the terms of our exchange and the ultimate resolution of our family disagreement." "What do you want?" Isabella demanded, though her voice suggested she already suspected the answer would not be acceptable to anyone with functioning moral instincts or basic human decency. "Everything," Cornelius said simply, his voice carrying the finality of absolute power exercised without constraint or accountability. "The evidence you carry naturally, along with any copies or duplicates you might have hidden elsewhere for insurance purposes. Your own surrender to face appropriate family justice for your betrayal of blood loyalty and family interests, and the permanent elimination of any witnesses who might carry tales about business activities that are better kept private for the protection of all concerned." The ultimatum hung in the air between them like a death sentence, confirming what they had all known but hoped might not prove true, that Cornelius had never intended to honor any agreement that left them alive to threaten his interests or expose his crimes to legal investigation. The only question now was whether they could find some way to rescue both Daniel and Jeremiah before violence became their only remaining option, and whether such violence would accomplish anything beyond ensuring their own deaths while failing to protect the people they had come to save. "You have exactly 1 hour to consider my terms and reach a decision," Cornelius continued, consulting an expensive gold pocket watch, with movements that suggested time was just another weapon in his extensive arsenal of intimidation and control. The building is completely surrounded by my personal security force, so escape is not a realistic option for people in your position. But I'm not an unreasonable man when people show proper respect for family authority and legitimate business necessities. But as he spoke these words, the building suddenly shook with an explosion that rattled windows throughout the structure and sent plaster dust drifting down from the ornate ceiling like snow in a blizzard. Emergency bells began ringing throughout the six-story structure, and the sound of running feet and shouting voices echoed from the floors below as smoke began to seep under the office doors, and emergency lighting flickered on to supplement the natural illumination that was rapidly being obscured by whatever was burning in the building's lower levels. "What in hell?" Cornelius demanded, his carefully maintained composure cracking for the first time since their confrontation had begun, revealing the fear and uncertainty that lay beneath his facade of absolute control and unlimited power. The answer came in the form of Daniel Thornton, who appeared in the doorway behind them with a smoking stick of dynamite in one small hand and an enormous revolver clutched in the other. His face was streaked with soot and grime. His clothes were torn from crawling through ventilation ducts in maintenance shafts that had never been designed for human passage. But his eyes burned with the kind of determined fury that had driven men to build nations and destroy empires when the cause was sufficiently just and the need sufficiently desperate. "Grandfather taught me about explosives when he told war stories," Daniel said with the practical tone children use when adults miss obvious solutions. "Seemed like you might need some help, so I figured I'd even things up a bit before you got here that seemed unnecessarily complicated. And I've been setting charges throughout this building for the past 2 hours while your guards were watching the lobby and the elevators like you told them to, never thinking that a kid might know ways to move around that grown men would never consider." The psychological impact of an 11-year-old boy appearing armed and dangerous in the middle of what was supposed to be Cornelius's impregnable fortress was almost as devastating as the physical damage his systematic sabotage had obviously caused to the building's structural integrity and defensive systems. "Daniel," Caleb called out, relief and pride warring with terror at seeing his son in such immediate danger while demonstrating the kind of courage and resourcefulness that would have made his mother proud beyond words. "Hi, Pa," the boy replied with a grin that reminded Caleb so powerfully of Sarah that his heart clenched with recognition and love and fear for what might happen to this remarkable child if their desperate gamble failed to produce the results they needed. "I figured you'd come looking for me eventually, so I thought I'd try to even the odds a little before you got here and had to fight your way through all those bad men downstairs." "How did you get free from your guards?" Isabella demanded, her voice filled with admiration for the boy's courage and ingenuity in escaping what should have been an impossible situation. "Mr. Steele's men aren't very smart about guarding kids," Daniel explained with a tone that suggested adults who underestimated children's capabilities deserved whatever consequences resulted from their oversight and poor planning. "They locked me in a room on the fourth floor but didn't think about air vents or maintenance passages or the fact that someone my size can fit through spaces they'd never consider and reach places they'd never think to guard." The building shook again as another explosion echoed from somewhere in its lower levels, followed by the sound of breaking glass and collapsing masonry that suggested Daniel's sabotage had been considerably more thorough and effective than anyone had imagined possible from such a young saboteur working alone against professional security forces. "We need to get grandfather and leave this place right now," the boy continued with the practical assessment of someone who understood that their tactical advantage would be temporary at best, and that discovery by hostile forces would mean death for everyone involved. "I used most of the explosives I found in the building's maintenance areas, but there are still a lot of armed men between us and the street, and they're going to be very angry when they figure out what's been happening to their nice, safe building." Cornelius, his face now pale with rage, and the dawning recognition that his carefully controlled situation had deteriorated into complete chaos through the intervention of a child he had dismissed as harmless leverage, reached for a weapon of his own with movements made clumsy by fury and disbelief. But Caleb was already in motion, covering the distance between them in 2 quick steps and driving his fist into the other man's jaw with all the accumulated rage of years of injustice and weeks of desperate pursuit concentrated into a single blow that carried the weight of absolute finality. The punch sent Cornelius crashing into an expensive cabinet filled with crystal decanters that exploded into glittering fragments, their costly contents spreading across priceless Persian carpets in stains that would never be completely removed. When he struggled to rise, blood streaming from his nose and mouth, he found himself looking into the barrel of Caleb's revolver held with the steady competence of someone who had killed men before and would not hesitate to do so again when circumstances demanded such decisive action. "The evidence stays with us," Caleb said quietly, his voice carrying the finality of absolute decision reached after careful consideration of all alternatives. "And if any member of your family or any of your employees come after us again, the next explosion will be directly under whatever building you're sleeping in at the time, with considerably more destructive force than what my son has demonstrated here today." Elizabeth Ashford stepped forward, her face showing a mixture of relief and determination that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this moment to act on convictions that had been growing stronger throughout the confrontation. "The family business ends here, Cornelius," she said quietly, producing her own weapon with movements that spoke of considerable practice and familiarity with its use. "I've been documenting your crimes for months, gathering evidence that will support Isabella's materials and ensure that federal prosecutors have everything they need to dismantle this entire criminal organization and send its leaders to prison for the remainder of their natural lives." "You treacherous bitch," Cornelius snarled through broken teeth and wounded pride that seemed to hurt him more than his physical injuries. "Family blood means nothing to you, does it? 40 years of building this empire, creating wealth and power that will last for generations. And you want to destroy it all for the sake of people who don't matter and never will matter in the larger scheme of American progress." "Some things matter more than money," Elizabeth replied with quiet dignity. "Some things matter more than family loyalty when that loyalty requires participating in murder and systematic corruption. Mother would have been ashamed of what you have become, what you've made our family name represent in territories where our business activities have destroyed so many innocent lives." They collected Jeremiah, who was barely conscious but still breathing with the stubborn persistence that had carried him through 7 decades of frontier life and military service, and made their way toward the building's service elevator that Daniel had scouted during his reconnaissance and sabotage activities. Behind them, Cornelius's voice followed with threats and promises of vengeance that seemed increasingly hollow as smoke continued to pour through the building and emergency bells rang with growing urgency that suggested his fortress was becoming his tomb. The escape from the Ashford building was a nightmare of smoke-filled corridors and collapsing staircases that tested their endurance and Daniel's knowledge of the building's hidden passages and emergency systems. But somehow, through a combination of the boy's intelligence, Elizabeth's insider knowledge, and sheer determination, they managed to reach street level and emerge into the chaos of a downtown district where fire wagons and police carriages were converging on what appeared to be a major industrial accident rather than a deliberate act of sabotage. In the confusion of emergency response and civilian spectators, 5 people carrying an injured man attracted little attention beyond offers of assistance from helpful citizens who assumed they were victims of the building collapse rather than its primary cause. By the time anyone thought to ask difficult questions about their identity or their business in the building, they had disappeared into the crowds that gathered wherever urban disasters provided free entertainment for people whose own lives contained insufficient excitement. They retrieved their horses and rode out of Denver as the sun was setting behind the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise better times ahead for people who had suffered long enough under the weight of injustice and criminal oppression. Behind them, smoke continued to rise from the Ashford building, carrying with it the dreams of empire and the systematic corruption that had poisoned territorial government for an entire generation. Jeremiah survived the difficult journey back to Wyoming, his tough constitution and Caleb's medical skills combining to pull him back from the edge of death that had seemed so close during their desperate escape from Denver. Elizabeth proved to be a valuable ally whose insider knowledge of Ashford business operations and criminal activities provided federal investigators with exactly the kind of detailed evidence they needed to prosecute cases that had seemed impossible to prove through normal investigative methods. The evidence Isabella and Elizabeth carried together eventually reached federal prosecutors whose integrity could not be purchased with Ashford money or influenced through political pressure, leading to arrests and convictions that cleaned up territorial government and established legal precedents that protected ordinary citizens from corporate predation and systematic corruption by wealthy interests who had previously operated with complete impunity. The Thornton Ranch was fully restored through legal action that vindicated Jeremiah's lifetime of honest work and provided Daniel with the inheritance his grandfather had always intended him to receive, along with compensation for years of illegal occupation by railroad interests who had stolen the land through fraudulent court proceedings and corrupted officials. Isabella chose to remain with the Thornton family rather than return to New York society, finding in frontier life and honest work the meaning and purpose that inherited wealth and social position had never provided despite all their material advantages. Elizabeth divided her time between managing the legitimate portions of the former Ashford business empire and working with federal authorities to identify and prosecute other criminal enterprises that had operated under the protection of political corruption and systematic bribery. On a spring morning exactly 1 year after their confrontation in Denver, Caleb stood on the porch of the rebuilt ranch house, watching his son practice the roping skills that Jeremiah had begun teaching him during the long months of the old man's recovery from wounds that had very nearly cost him his life. Isabella worked in the garden that Sarah had originally planted, tending flowers that bloomed again after years of neglect during their exile from land that had always been rightfully theirs. The letter from federal marshals had arrived the previous week, informing them that Magnus Steele had been captured while attempting to cross into Mexico with a fortune in stolen gold, and that the remaining members of the Ashford criminal organization had been scattered to various federal prisons where they would spend whatever remained of their lives paying for crimes that had destroyed too many innocent families throughout the territorial system. Cornelius himself had died in the Denver building collapse, crushed by falling masonry as he attempted to escape the consequences of his own criminal actions and the justice he had so long evaded through wealth and political influence. His death had brought no particular satisfaction to any of them, only a weary relief that the threat he represented was finally ended and that Daniel could grow up without looking over his shoulder for enemies who might never forgive or forget the role his family had played in exposing decades of systematic corruption. As Caleb watched his son demonstrate skills that would serve him well in the life they were building together on land that belonged to them completely and legally, he thought about the remarkable chain of events that had brought them to this moment of peace and genuine prosperity. A woman found dying in a blizzard, a decision to help a stranger despite obvious dangers, and the courage to pursue justice even when the odds seemed completely impossible and the enemies appeared to possess unlimited resources and political protection. "Pa," Daniel called from the corral where he was working with a young horse that showed considerable promise of becoming something truly special with proper training and patient care. "Miss Isabella says she'll teach me to read French if you think it would be useful for my education and future prospects." "I think," Caleb replied, his voice carrying the contentment that had been missing from his life since Sarah's death, "that a man should learn as much as possible about the world beyond these mountains and these valleys. Your mother would have wanted that for you, wanted you to have every possible advantage and opportunity to make something significant of your life." Isabella looked up from her gardening, soil on her hands and happiness in her face that transformed her features in ways that reminded him daily of why he had fallen in love with this remarkable woman who had brought both danger and salvation to their door. She nodded toward this boy with the kind of maternal pride that suggested their family had expanded in ways that honored the past while embracing whatever future they chose to build together through honest work and mutual dedication. The winter that had brought them together was finally over, replaced by spring warmth and the promise of seasons yet to come, filled with possibilities that had seemed impossible during the darkest moments of their struggle against forces that had appeared too powerful and too well protected to be defeated by ordinary people and armed with nothing but determination and the simple conviction that justice should not be reserved only for those wealthy enough to purchase it. And in that moment, surrounded by the people he loved most in a place that belonged to them completely, Caleb Thornton understood a truth as clear as mountain air. Sometimes the most unexpected storms delivered the greatest blessings. The winter that had nearly killed them all had brought them Isabella, had revealed the corruption poisoning their territory, had given them the chance to fight for something larger than themselves. In the distance, wolves called across the valley, not with hunger, but with the wild joy of creatures who had reclaimed their rightful place in the world, just as his family had reclaimed theirs. The Ashford Laws, as the territorial reforms came to be known, would protect homesteaders for generations. And Daniel, practicing French with his new mother by lamplight, would grow up to become the kind of man who ensured such protection never wavered. Some storms, Caleb thought, were worth riding into.